Hi, my name's Ben, and before we get into this course, I want to say some words about equity and gender in physics. And I'll start by asking a rhetorical question, and that question is, who are these physicists? They, in case you hadn't recognized them, are the winners of the 1957 Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of parity violation in the weak nuclear force. Yang and Li. My next question is, who's this? Well, this is Chien-Shiung Wu. She, in 1956, averaging not very many hours of sleep a night for months on end, led an experiment that demonstrated parity violation of the weak nuclear force. Now, this is a result that was not actually widely expected. The theory paper that Li and Yang wrote was met with some skepticism, but she did an experiment that demonstrated that they were correct. She was also the first to do an experiment that showed quantum entanglement. That was in 1949, and she was also rated as the best scientist to have on your side in a bar brawl. I found this in an online list. I'll post a link to that at the end. Now, despite all of these awesome achievements, she did not win the Nobel Prize in 1957 for the demonstration of weak nuclear force parity violation. It was awarded to Li and Yang only, who proposed the effect. And it was widely seen, I guess more with the benefit of hindsight, this is to do with gender bias and also that she was Chinese. So, what has this got to do with us? Well, we might think that 1957 is a long time ago and we've all moved on and we don't have to deal with gender bias in physics or maths anymore. What I've got here is some data for the gender gap in physics and maths courses for a few different countries. And we can see there are some countries indeed where the genders are pretty evenly split. For physics, France and Italy have almost a 50-50 split, and mathematics, for example, Slovenia and Portugal, again, pretty even split between males and females. This is not the case in many countries, and certainly not the case in Australia. For mathematics, we write down here at the bottom with about a 2/3, 1/3 split, and physics, it's even worse at about 3/4, 1/4. What this means is that your experience of studying physics and maths in Australia is really different to your experience studying physics and maths in some other countries where there is less of a gender gap. And for people in Australia, you may come to a conclusion, for example, that because you don't see as many women studying physics in school, there is some reason for that which is inherent, that some people still have the mistaken belief that women are not as good at physics and maths as men are. Now we know, because we have years of data from courses at ANU, this is not the case. For students at ANU, we can see no difference between the performance of men and women studying our courses. Furthermore, there is no credible published research that demonstrates a difference between the genders in terms of performance in maths and physics. That's not to say that men and women approach things the same way. There are clearly differences in gender, but they do not affect the performance in studying maths and physics or being professional mathematicians and physicists. And yet we have a problem, and the problem is that in Australia we have very few women who make it through to the end of physics at year 12 and fewer at university still. And we've got to ask ourselves the question, why is that? And one of the very clear reasons we can identify for that is this blatant discrimination. We hear stories all the time of women and girls in school being told that maths and physics is too hard and they should try doing something easier. This is almost a direct verbatim quote of something that I know that students have been told. And there's an attitude here, an attitudinal problem, which is very hard to combat. And the result is that by the time we get to university level, there are a lot of women who are missing, who maybe could be here because they have the ability and had the interest, but were dissuaded from doing these courses by people around them, by their peers, by teachers, and maybe just felt out of place because at some point they realize they look around and in a physics course only 25% of the people there are women, and they think, well, maybe I'm in the wrong place. And we should all be angry about this because, for one thing, there are people missing who could be here, but for another thing, for the people who are left over, the ones who do make it through to the end of year 12 and start studying physics at university, the experience is diminished by having less diversity in our classroom. Diversity is strength in many things. There's a lot of research being published now that shows that diverse workplaces, diverse research environments perform better. And in a learning environment, diversity is also great. You see different approaches to solving problems simply by having a diversity of people in your classroom. So this is a problem that we want to solve. And the first step in solving the problem is understanding where it comes from. Before I go on with that though, I want to make a point that it's not just gender that can be an issue for people in the classroom. Physics courses also lack people from some ethnic groups, people of Aboriginal descent, and people who openly identify as LGBTQI. And anybody who feels different in an environment, be it in a physics course, a maths course, or a biology course, any of their courses at university, if you feel that you're different from the majority of people, you might start to think that you're in the wrong place. You shouldn't be studying it because you're not the same as the other people you see around you. You feel a pressure just from being a part of a minority. Now, there's not as much data on other groups in physics, the different ethnic backgrounds or sexuality, but the same principles apply. Anyone who identifies as being part of a minority can feel pressure because they feel like they don't belong. If, on the other hand, you, like me, are white and male, then you're used to seeing plenty of similar people around you in physics. So our lived experience is not representative of people who are in a minority. And so it's especially important for people like us to think about how we behave and think about the things we say and the things we do to make sure that our actions help to make everyone around us feel welcome and important. So hopefully this discussion so far has convinced you that physics is really not just about equations and models. This is an idea that is sometimes used when people push back against discussions of gender and race in physics, that physics is just equations and models and doesn't care who's using them. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Physics, and indeed all of science, is a human endeavour. And it matters which humans get to use these equations and use these models, because that will dictate what they're used for and the way in which they're used and the ideas that people have. If we have less diversity in physics, we end up with less diversity of ideas and applications and less progress. And in the very pointy end of physics, where people get Nobel Prizes, it affects the range of people who can achieve such greatness. And so it's really important to understand that physics and science is not some pure endeavour that seeks only truth, that is separate from humanity. It's very much a part of humanity, and we have to deal with these issues as we go through our careers in science. So, what can you do? Well, the first thing is don't be a part of the problem. Check your biases and be nice to everyone. I want to say some words before I go on about what a bias is and how it manifests and the kinds of impact that bias can have. Now, a trivial example of a bias might be that you grew up in a family that didn't eat cabbage, and because you never ate cabbage, you just assumed it tastes terrible, and you're biased against cabbage. This is a kind of bias that isn't going to hurt anybody. You might discover later in life that you've been duped, and in fact cabbage is delicious, and you can feel cranky that you never had any when you're a kid, but, in the scheme of things, anti-cabbage bias is harmless. There are other kinds of biases that can be much more harmful. And there are examples that hold back science in many different ways. One that's been identified is that we have an inherent bias towards studying animals with backbones, birds, lizards, other mammals, presumably because they are more like us. We feel some sort of kinship towards these species in a way that we don't when we look at worms or insects or invertebrates. And so there's a bias towards studying things that are more like us, and so consequently we know a lot less about this huge class of animals and that are less like us. Another example of bias, and this one's in physics, is a bias towards elegance and symmetry. We go looking for theories that combine relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics, and we look to theories like supersymmetry, because humans are attracted to things that are symmetric and elegant. But physics doesn't care what we think. Maybe we should be looking for an ugly theory that combines quantum mechanics and general relativity. But we're biased, and so this could be something that holds us back. But the bias we're trying to get to today is not a bias against food or animals or asymmetry. It's a gender bias, or indeed any kind of bias against people based on their appearance or their sexuality. We know that this is still a problem at ANU, at least in terms of direct gender discrimination, because we've spoken to women in courses at ANU who have experienced gender discrimination. That means assumptions that they're not as good at pushing buttons on an oscilloscope because of their gender, assumptions they're not as good at solving problems because of their gender. Now, I guess we, in some sense, can't be surprised that racial and sexual discrimination could be a problem at ANU, if our country has a broader problem with discrimination and bias, ANU isn't going to be devoid of that unless we put in effort to make it go away. And so what I'm asking is that all of us, as students and teaching staff, taking these courses, teaching these courses, we put in that effort and try our best to achieve a learning environment which is free of bias and free of discrimination. And together, we can do this. This is a problem that can be solved. So how do we be a part of the solution? Well, we have to look after each other and make sure that everyone around us gets the opportunities that they deserve. This is really simple stuff often. It's if you find yourself doing a lot of talking, maybe be quiet for a while and listen to someone else who hasn't had a chance to say much. Some people are shy and it's less natural for them to say things, even if they have something that they want to say. So give people a chance to express themselves. In a laboratory environment, if you find yourself being the one who is doing a lot of the manual work, the pushing the buttons, and someone else is always taking the data, switch roles. Share it around. Make sure everyone gets a chance to take part in all the different parts of the experimental program and of the activity that you're undertaking. Number 3, if you see poor behaviour, you can call it out. You have a right to call it out if it's disturbing you, and you'll be supported by the teaching staff if you call it out. You don't have to do it in person. You can do it anonymously, and you don't have to do it at all. It's really up to you. But it's something that's often hidden from the teaching staff, and we really appreciate it when these problems are brought to our attention, because otherwise it's actually very hard for us to take action. And number 4, you can talk to the teaching staff at any time about any of these issues, whether they affect you or others around you. We're always here to help. Finally, here are some sources that I used when I was putting this little slideshow together. So thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and see you in the courses.